This is Russia, the biggest country in the world by landmass. But Russia's economy isn't as distributed as its surface area. The majority of its GDP is concentrated within this circle in its western region. This has always been a big issue for every Russian leader, and now it's a big headache for Putin, as his invasion of Ukraine has accelerated what some predict to be another disintegration of the Russian state. In fact, just last month, there was news of Russian separatists rising and taking over the town of Belgorod at the Russian-Ukrainian border. Does this signal the beginning of the end? Things may seem stable now in Russia, but remember, things were stable in the 1980s before the Soviet Union collapsed. Things were stable in the 1910s before the Russian empires collapsed then. So even though things look stable now, we can't rule out a collapse, because similarities have started to appear to those who know Russian history. So, what would a Russian collapse in the 21st century look like? How would global and regional powers like the US and China take advantage of the situation to further cement their place? Let's get into all that in this video. And be sure to hit the like button. Support on recent videos have really meant a lot, and I truly mean it when I say my channel would be nowhere if it wasn't for the support and likes. So thank you so much, guys. Many have pointed out that Putin is making the same mistakes that many Russian leaders before him have made. And this may lead Russia down a similar path of disintegration like it did before. You see, the roots of Russia can be traced back to a small empire of Moscow. Of course, Russia's history, much like any other country's history, is long, but don't worry, I'll keep it quick. It is important to understand its history because, as the quote earlier points out, national interest is predetermined by history, at least in this case. Back in the days, Moscow was a peaceful place, but it became not so peaceful when the Mongols invaded in the 1200s, then ruled over it, extracting value out of its natural resources and people. This became a great lesson for Russians as they learned Moscow, or the core of Russia, is hard to protect since there is no natural protections like an ocean or mountains. So when Ivan the Great freed Russia from the Mongols in the late 1400s, he set out to expand Russia and create a buffer zone between Moscow and Moscow's enemies. After Ivan the Great's death, Ivan the Terrible became the Tsar of Russia. Unlike his name implies, he actually continued Russian expansion far into the east, bringing Siberia under Moscow's control. Side note, he got the nickname Ivan the Terrible because of his reign of terror against the Russian nobility. After he died in 1584, Moscow goes into civil war, it's invaded by Poland, but Polish rule only lasts a couple of years, then Moscow goes back into chaos, and that chaos continues until Mikhail Romanov takes over Russia in 1613. From there on, the Romanov dynasty continues ruling over Russia for 3 centuries and continues expanding Russian borders here and there. In fact, during the dynasty, Russia expanded all the way up to Alaska, and until 1865, Alaska was actually a Russian territory. In 1865, Russia sold Alaska and the Aleutian Islands to the United States. Now, we did speed through a lot of history here because mainly it didn't relate to the story, but here's what's really important. This is Russia's map in 1914. They have expanded a lot, from a small city of Moscow when the Mongols invaded, to this. Now it's a full-on empire. In fact, it's the biggest empire in the world, all in an effort to create a buffer between Moscow and Moscow's enemies. Then, in 1914, Russia decided to enter World War I. This would be the last war Russia would fight under the Tsar. You see, before this, Russia had fought multiple wars and lost multiple wars, like the Crimean War and the Russo-Japanese War. Each loss came at a hefty cost. Wartime created frequent food shortages across the Russian Empire, and the country suffered heavy losses of soldiers, ships, money, and international prestige. So, as you can tell, even before entering World War I, Russia was at a delicate stage. In fact, in 1905, there were large protests by Russian workers against the monarchy, where hundreds of unarmed protesters were killed by Tsar troops. This massacre sparked the Russian Revolution in 1905, during which angry workers responded with a series of crippling strikes throughout the country. To calm all this down, Nicholas II promised greater freedom of speech and the formation of a representative assembly, or Duma, to work towards a reform. He also promised that he would give out a special thank you note to everyone who subscribes to Business Basics, so be sure to hit that sub button below. Okay, actually, I'm the one promising that. Alright, jokes aside. Clearly, Russia wasn't in a position to fight a war, economically or militarily. Entering World War I only made things worse for Russians at home. Russian casualties were greater than those sustained by any other nation in any previous war. Food and fuel shortages plagued Russia as inflation mounted. The already weak economy was hopelessly disrupted by the costly war effort. Government corruption was rampant. The Russian economy remained backwards, and Nicholas repeatedly dissolved the Duma when it opposed his will. In 1917, revolution broke out in Petrograd, today St. Petersburg, where protesters clashed with police and refused to give up. Protests got so big that it gave the Duma the opportunity to form a provisional government and remove the Tsar from the throne. The new government continued the Russian war efforts in World War I, even though Russia's food supply problems continued to persist. This exacerbated the unrest in the country. Then, later that year, another party called the Bolshevik Party, led by a guy named Vladimir Lenin, maybe you've heard of him, saw the opportunity and overthrew the Duma's provisional government. This was the official rise of the Russian Communist Party, which was born after the first fall of the Russian Empire. After centuries of expansion, Russia got too big for a central leader to control. But Russian thirst for expansion didn't stop, and that's what led to this eventual downfall. Remember this, as this will be a common theme in modern Russian history, and quite likely to be the theme of current Russia. During all of this havoc, Russia lost a considerable amount of territory. One of the most significant losses was the territory of Poland, which had been partitioned between Russia, Prussia, and Austria-Hungary in the late 18th century. In 1918, Poland declared independence and fought a war against Soviet Russia to secure its borders. The war ended with the Treaty of Riga in 1921, which recognized Polish independence and gave Poland control of significant territories that had previously been part of the Russian Empire. In addition to Poland, the Soviet Union also lost control of Finland, which declared independence in 1917, and fought a brief war against Soviet Russia in 1918. The resulting Treaty of Tartu in 1920 recognized Finland's independence and established the new border between Finland and Soviet Russia. Similarly, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania also declared independence in 1918 and fought wars against Soviet Russia to secure their independence. The resulting treaties recognized their independence and established new borders between them and the Soviet Union. Finally, after the end of World War I, Romania gained significant territories from Russia as a result of the Treaty of Bucharest in 1918. These territories included parts of Bessarabia, Bukovina, and Transylvania. Overall, the loss of these territories was a significant blow to the Soviet Union, which had hoped to maintain control over its former imperial territories. After everything was settled, Russia lost about 30% of its territory. Overall, the loss of these territories was a significant blow to Russia's prestige and power, which eventually led to new leaders taking control at the helm. The loss of territory had several economic consequences for Russia. The territories that Russia lost were rich in natural resources like timber, minerals, and agricultural land, which were important sources of income and exports. Losing access to these resources had a significant impact on the Russian economy, which was already struggling after World War I and the Russian Revolution. The loss of these territories also had an impact on Russia's economic and trade relations with other countries. The newly independent states that emerged from the territories that Russia lost often pursued their own trade policies, which were different than Russia's. This affected Russia's access to markets and goods, as well as its ability to negotiate trade agreements. In addition, the loss of these territories weakened Russia's ability to project power and influence in the region. This made Russia more vulnerable to external threats and challenges, which affected its economic stability and growth. The loss of these territories also had a profound impact on the Russian national identity and psyche, which had been tied to the idea of a powerful and expansive empire. The loss of these territories challenged this identity and contributed to a sense of loss and disillusionment among many Russians. Overall, the loss of territory had a significant impact on the Russian economy and society, which was felt for many years. This economic hardship helped Stalin consolidate power, who came into a leadership position in the late 1920s. After taking control, he implemented a series of policies that aimed to rapidly industrialize the Soviet economy, at any cost. This meant forced collectivization of agriculture and the development of heavy industry. This policy was aimed at transforming the Soviet Union from an agricultural society into an industrial powerhouse, and it led to significant economic growth and modernization. However, the policies of forced collectivization and industrialization also had significant human costs. Millions of people were forcibly relocated to collective farms, and many died in famines and other disasters that were caused by the disruption of traditional agricultural practices. The development of heavy industry was also accompanied by poor working conditions and a lack of regard for worker safety, which led to many accidents and deaths. The Stalinist regime was also characterized by brutal repression of political opposition. Stalin's regime was responsible for the execution of hundreds of thousands of people, and millions more were sent to labor camps or imprisoned in the infamous Gulag system. The Soviet secret police, also known as the NKVD, carried out mass purges of political opponents, intellectuals, and other perceived enemies of the state. The regime also implemented strict censorship and propaganda measures to control the flow of information and maintain its grip on power. Once the economy was growing and dissent at home was under control, Stalin focused on expanding the Soviet Empire once again. Now, this is a mistake I made in a previous video that many of you pointed out. I called the Soviets the good guys in World War II, when in fact this really wasn't the case. Soviets were in fact the aggressors in World War II, just like the Germans. In 1939, Soviets signed a secret pact with Germans, agreeing to not go against the Nazis when they invaded Poland. The agreement also included a protocol dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Stalin used this pact as an opportunity to go on a conquest of his own. Soon after signing the agreement, the Soviet Union annexed the eastern part of Poland in September of 1939, shortly after Nazi Germany invaded from the west. The Soviet Union also annexed parts of Romania in 1940, following a Soviet ultimatum to the Romanian government. During the Winter War in Finland in 1939 and 1940, the Soviet Union annexed parts of Finnish territory, including the Karelian Isthmus. However, the Soviet Union was unable to achieve its objective of conquering Finland, and the annexation of Finnish territory was widely condemned by the international community. While all of this was happening, Hitler had taken over a big part of Western Europe, and as the war was progressing, he started to see the Soviet Union as a potential target for expansion. So, on June 22, 1941, Germany launched a surprise attack known as Operation Barbarossa against Soviets, which forced Stalin to join the Allies and fight against Germany. After this, the Soviet Union played a key role in defeating Nazi Germany and their allies, and its military forces occupied large portions of Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union established communist governments in many of these occupied countries, which were seen as satellite states of the Soviet Union. These governments were often installed through rigged elections or through the use of force, and they were characterized by political repression, censorship, and the suppression of dissent. The Soviet Union annexed several territories that had been part of Nazi Germany or its allies, including parts of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Prussia. The annexation of these territories contributed to the division of Europe into two opposing blocs, the Western democracies and the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact. Now, this new Soviet Union was no different than the history of Russia. If you remember the start of our story, Moscow started as a city and expanded into a union of many, many different states and regions. Much like the Soviet Union, Russia has always been a union of regions and people that come from different cultures, speak different languages, and share unique beliefs. Now, this makes Russian culture very diverse, but it also makes it very susceptible to a breakaway state when things are not going well. We'll get back to this in just a minute. After World War II, the world went into the Cold War. In a speech, Winston Churchill declared an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent, and the Cold War grows as the Soviets promote revolution in China, Asia, and Middle East. In 1949, the Soviets exploded a nuclear bomb, hastening the nuclear arms race. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union pursued a socialist economic system that emphasized state ownership of the means of production and central planning. The Soviet economy was heavily focused on heavy industry and military spending. with a large portion of resources devoted to the production of weapons and other military equipment. While the Soviet economy grew rapidly in the years immediately following World War II, that all slowed down as productivity slowed down. This was due in part to a lack of investment in new technology and equipment, and the central planning system, which made it difficult to innovate and improve production methods. Much like today's Russia, the Soviet economy was heavily dependent on exports of oil, gas, and other natural resources to earn foreign currency. However, fluctuations in global commodity prices and changes in international demand made it difficult to maintain a stable source of income. The economy was also never able to become diversified because it wasn't a free market. It was centralized decision-making, aka a modified version of a communist system. In this system, the government would set targets for production and allocated resources. This made it a very inefficient economy when it came to serving its citizens. Here's a simplified explanation on why this didn't work. The government would tell workers what they needed to work on. So you would get orders to make a bunch of cereal for the country, but many factories are getting the same orders. That means you aren't producing a lot of bread. But now let's say public taste changes and they want bread instead of cereal. You as a factory owner aren't able to just switch your resources to producing bread because you are required to follow orders from the government. Now, governments are always slow to adapt, so demand for cereal isn't what it used to be and supply is the same. So you have an overproduction of cereal and a shortage of bread. I realize this is a very stupid example, but hopefully you guys get my point. Now imagine this happening across the whole economy. You can see why this is a problem. And a quick reminder to hit that like button if you haven't already. I apologize for the interruption. Okay, let's get back to the video. On top of all this, the Soviet Union also faced economic sanctions and embargoes from the West, which further strained the economy. One of the most visible effects of the Soviet Union's economic challenges was the shortage of basic goods, such as food, clothing, and household items. Queues for basic goods were common, and many people had to rely on the black market to obtain essential items. The economic challenges also led to a decline in the quality of life for many of its citizens. Housing conditions were often cramped and inadequate, and public services such as healthcare and education suffered from underfunding and neglect. Despite the Soviet Union's emphasis on equality, many workers had low wages and limited opportunities for advancement. The lack of incentives for workers and managers to increase efficiency or reduce waste also contributed to low productivity and poor working conditions. Then, in the 1980s, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev introduced a series of economic reforms, known as perestroika, in an attempt to modernize the Soviet economy. Perestroika was intended to modernize and restructure the Soviet economy in order to improve productivity, promote innovation, and encourage greater efficiency. The reforms were broad and encompassed many different areas of the Soviet economy, including agriculture, industry, and foreign trade. One of the key aspects of perestroika was the decentralization of economic decision-making. Under the previous system of central planning, enterprises had little autonomy in deciding what to produce and how to allocate resources. Perestroika aimed to give enterprises greater flexibility in those areas, in order to encourage innovation and improve efficiency. Another important aspect of perestroika was the promotion of market-oriented reforms. This included the introduction of limited private enterprise, the development of a stock market, and greater opportunities for foreign investment. The hope was that these reforms would encourage innovation and promote greater efficiency in the Soviet economy. Perestroika also aimed to promote greater openness and transparency in government and economic affairs. This included the relaxation of censorship and the encouragement of public debate on economic and political issues. Despite these goals, the implementation of perestroika was uneven and often met with resistance from conservative elements within the Communist Party and the Soviet bureaucracy. The reforms were also hampered by a lack of clear direction and a failure to address fundamental problems within the Soviet economy. While the economy and citizens at home struggled, Russia entered another war in Afghanistan, which many see as a common trend before the fall of a Russian empire. On Christmas Eve, 1979, the Soviet Union began an invasion of Afghanistan to support the communist government there because it didn't want the region to fall to NATO's hands as it considered it to be an important geopolitical location. The Afghan War quickly settled down into a stalemate, with more than 100,000 Soviet troops controlling the cities, larger towns, and major garrisons, and the Mujahideen moving with relative freedom through the countryside. This forced the Soviets to dedicate more resources to the war instead of focusing on improving the domestic economy. The war became a quagmire for what, by the late 1980s, was a disintegrating Soviet Union. By then, the Soviets had suffered tens of thousands of losses. The war wreaked havoc, not only on Afghanistan, but on the Soviet Union, whose economy and national prestige took a severe drubbing. Back at home, perestroika failed to modernize the Soviet economy and address the deep-seated problems that had been developing over decades of central planning and bureaucratic inefficiencies. Decades of economic challenges had exacerbated the economic inequality. Many workers had low wages and limited opportunities for advancement, while officials and party members often enjoyed special privileges and access to scarce goods. The Soviet Union's economic challenges contributed to widespread skepticism of the government's ability to manage the economy and provide for its citizens. This, in turn, contributed to a broader sense of disillusionment with the Soviet system and the government's ability to deliver on its promise. By now, the USSR had become one of the biggest nations in the world, occupying nearly 1/6 of the Earth's landmass, and was made up of 15 republics: Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Russia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. But cracks were now beginning to show. The divide between the extreme wealth of the elites and the poverty of Soviet citizens created a backlash for younger people who refused to adopt Communist Party ideology as their parents had. Meanwhile, Gorbachev's reforms were slow to bear fruit and did more to hasten the collapse of the Soviet Union rather than help it. A loosening of controls over the Soviet people emboldened independence movements in the satellite states of Eastern Europe. Political revolutions in Poland in 1989 sparked other, mostly peaceful revolutions across Eastern European states and led to the toppling of the Berlin Wall. An unsuccessful coup by Communist Party hardliners in August 1991 sealed the Soviet Union's fate by diminishing Gorbachev's power and propelling democratic forces, led by Boris Yeltsin, to the forefront of Russian politics. On December 25th, Gorbachev resigned as the leader of the USSR. The Soviet Union ceased to exist on December 31st, 1991. All 15 republics we talked about earlier became independent states. The Soviets also lost control of territories it controlled in Finland, Poland, and Romania. Collapse also led to a sharp decline in industrial output and a rise in unemployment. In 1991 alone, the GDP dropped by about 1/6, and the budget deficit was approximately 1/4 of GDP. Hyperinflation ran rampant because of this and led to the collapse of local currency in newly formed Russia. Just to put into perspective how bad this economic downturn was for Russia, it is widely believed to be worse than the 1930s Great Depression that was experienced in the United States. While all this was happening, Chechnya tried to gain independence from Russia, where Putin used brutal tactics to kill the revolution. I have a detailed video about this on the second channel if you guys are interested in the full story. After one of the fastest privatization efforts, which gave rise to loads of oligarchs, Russia was on its way to become a democracy and a market economy. Then, Putin came into power in the late 1990s as prime minister. Later, he won his bid to the presidency in the early 2000s, and everything changed. Just to get an idea of what Putin's goal is, here's a little sneak peek into his mind. Putin described the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. Based on his actions since he came into power, we can see that Putin is on a mission to reassemble the Soviet Union. He has consolidated power in the Russian parliament, used a puppet as a president to keep control while he was away from office, and since then has abolished any term limits for Russian presidents, aka himself. Political dissent is punished by poison and being thrown in jail, as we saw with Navalny. Putin has also used military forces to directly aid regions from past Soviet states to fight against their military. Like in 2008, when Russian forces entered Georgian territory to gain control of the separatist Georgian regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Russia has since maintained its military presence in both regions. Then again in 2014, when Putin famously annexed Crimea from Ukraine. Putin tried building on this move by launching a full-scale invasion in 2022. But it seems like this may be the last straw that breaks Russia's union. Much like the Soviet Union, Russia today is a federal state, with 83 republics and regions that are colonized by the Kremlin. It's the biggest nation by landmass, spanning across 11 time zones. 20% of its population is not ethnically Russian, but instead belong to local indigenous nations. Once again, following its thirst for expansion, Moscow is in a war where it's bleeding men and resources, all while its domestic economy is struggling. Worse yet, this has become a war of ammunition, where Moscow is fighting to keep up with supplies from the whole West. In a war where Russia is expected to outlast NATO's pockets, all while being cut off from global trade as the most sanctioned nation on Earth. This seems like a recipe for disaster. With casualties continuing to pile up and no end in sight for President Vladimir Putin's messianic revanchism, the eventual dissolution of the Russian Federation can no longer be dismissed out of hand. Ever since Putin targeted specific nationalities such as Sakha, Tatars, and Chechens for conscription, the cry for autonomy has picked up. Of course, this desire to be free is nothing new, especially among Russia's minority regions. Previously, the Kremlin was always able to snuff out extremists who could pose a problem, but this time the desire may be different. Kremlin resources are running thin, and Western governments are more willing than ever to fight Russia against its brutality. Russia has a long history of leaders employing a mix of carrots and sticks to keep the country's far-flung regions united. Tsars granted cultural autonomy to some conquered nations, while they violently forced assimilation on others. The Soviet regime followed that same playbook, sometimes celebrating national identities, sometimes deporting and punishing peoples deemed unfaithful to the Soviet project. Under Putin's rule, growing socioeconomic disparities between residents in rich metropolitan centers and those in poorer provincial regions have generated tensions. The war in Ukraine could increase calls for greater autonomy from Moscow. The military mobilization in September has generated a backlash in areas with large populations of ethnic minorities, whose conscriptions have already suffered high casualty rates. Even though few may want Russia's dissolution today, it's not difficult to imagine a scenario where growing political, economic, and social instability will, at some point, compel Russia's constituent units to seek safety and independence. If Russia somehow withdraws from a war in a manner that hurts its prestige, it could set off a chain reaction much like it did in 1989 when it withdrew from Afghanistan. This will evoke opposition to Putin's policies and propel a revolution to replace him. That's why the Kremlin is fearful of even the slightest public unrest. Public protests can quickly spiral into a major event, especially during an economic downturn caused by Putin's war. If protests become too big, local politicians will quickly realize that supporting Putin may not be in their best interest. This will present a big problem for Putin, as in remote regions, local leaders have much more favorable public support than Putin does. If a situation like this happens, the Kremlin may try to steer the population towards ethnic scapegoating by depicting a potential separatist republic as an existential threat to Russia, similar to what it did in Chechnya in the 1990s. Even with all these possibilities, Putin's biggest threat lies right now next to him in Moscow. Russia's political stability revolves around the elites supporting Putin. During times of uncertainty, power struggles could erupt between rival elites and oligarchs. These conflicts can burst into the open, adding fuel to the unrest around the country. As of the writing of the script, the Wagner Group leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, posted a poll in his Telegram channel asking his supporters if they would vote for him as president against Putin. As this shows, elitist loyalty towards Putin is not based on ideology, but on economic and political benefits. If elites feel that Putin can't deliver that anymore, they will be quick to turn on him. The failed war with Ukraine, which has revealed the weakness of Putin and his state, could very well be the spark that ignites the frayed timbers of Russian institutions. Of course, sparks are unpredictable. and Russia could weather the current crisis and survive in its present form, whether under Putin or a successor. But even if it does, it will be severely weakened as a state, and all the structural tensions will remain. Putin may even suspect this. In his 2023 New Year's address, he invoked the war's potential threat to Russian independence, something he has not said before. If Russia were to collapse, the biggest issue to arise would be how its nuclear arsenal is handled. This will be a huge point for all countries, including those in the EU, the USA, and China, because no one wants Russia's nuclear weapons to fall into dangerous hands. Considering this point, it's fair to say that no country really wants Russia to collapse, but it's easy to forget that the USA and the West had very little to do with the USSR's collapse. Bigger structural forces were the reason behind the USSR's collapse, and they could be the reason behind Russia's future collapse. No one knows what will happen to the nuclear arsenal, but everyone will try to make sure it doesn't lead to a world-ending event. But there are definitely other points where superpowers will disagree. China is heavily dependent on imported energy to fuel its rapid economic growth, and Russia has become an increasingly important supplier of oil and natural gas to China in these recent years. In 2020, Russia was China's largest supplier of crude oil, accounting for around 15% of China's total crude oil imports, and also supplied around 12% of China's natural gas imports. If Russia were to collapse, it could disrupt the flow of oil and natural gas to China, potentially leading to shortages and higher prices. This could have significant economic implications for China, as well as for global energy markets. China would seek to increase its influence in the region and fill the power vacuum left by Russia's collapse. China has been expanding its economic and political influence in Central Asia and other neighboring regions, and a collapse of Russia could create opportunities for China to bolster its position in the region. China may also be concerned about the potential for instability and conflict in the region following the collapse of Russia. China is already facing challenges in its western Xinjiang region, where there have been separatist movements and ethnic tensions, and a collapse of Russia could exacerbate these issues. Additionally, China may be concerned about the potential for a flood of refugees or an increase in transnational crime and terrorism in the region. China would also be very wary of the USA's actions in the region following a collapse, and would probably look to counter them. The United States would likely react to a collapse of Russia in a number of different ways, depending on the specific circumstances surrounding such an event. One possible scenario is that the United States would seek to increase its influence in the region and fill the power vacuum left by Russia's collapse. The United States has long been interested in promoting democracy and human rights in Russia, and a collapse of the Russian government could provide an opportunity for the United States to push for greater political and economic reforms in the country. On the other hand, the United States may also be concerned about the potential for instability and conflict in the region following a collapse of Russia. A power vacuum in Russia could lead to increased competition among other countries, such as China and European powers, for influence in the region. This could potentially lead to increased tensions and conflict, which could threaten the US interests in the region. European countries have significant economic ties with Russia, particularly in the areas of energy and trade. A collapse of Russia could disrupt the economic ties and potentially lead to economic losses for European countries. Additionally, European countries may be concerned about the potential for instability and conflict in the region, particularly if there were a breakdown in law and order or a mass exodus of refugees. I'm sure every country is following the war closely, and if 1989 was any lesson, many superpowers are preparing their response to all possible scenarios. This took an insane amount of effort, so please be sure to hit the like button. It helps me out a lot. Thank you. If you're someone who's missing out on the latest news on this war and, in fact, any geopolitics, then I would have to say that that's on you. Because I recently launched Global Recaps, a geopolitics newsletter that I send directly to your inbox covering the most important world news of the day. It's simple, takes only 5 minutes to read, and best of all, it's completely free. So sign up now using the link in the description and never miss out on any news.